Okay, I'm Lorna Goldberg, and my brother got involved in a cult, and
But tell them a little bit about yourself.
yeah,
Okay.
I will a little bit. And after my family rescued him from that group, my husband and I, Bill, and I started a support group. We were both social workers at that time, and we started a support group for former cult members. And that next year it will be 40 years that we've had that support group. So that still is running once a month at our house. And through that support group, we've learned so much and we've gained so much over the years. In the meantime, both of us had further education. We both became psychoanalysts in addition to being social workers. And I'm now on the board of ICSA. I'm a past president of ICSA. So.
Can I just, can you hear back there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. That's enough about me. And today I wanted to talk about first-generation parents and second-generation children working towards increased understanding and empathy in the family. I'll begin with the definition of empathy. From the Greek, empathia, in, and pathos is passion or feeling. Empathy is defined as an understanding so intimate that the feelings, thoughts, and motives of one are readily comprehended by another. I have found that there are many factors that contribute to making it difficult for empathy to exist between first-generation parents and their second-generation children. Today I will discuss some of these factors and some of the ways in which a therapist might bridge this gap. The first factor I'd identify as the cult's foster dissociation and the defense of identification with the aggressor instead of empathy. As you all know, the cult relationship is based upon a lie. The true purpose of the cult is hidden from view, and recruits are deceived at the outset. The cultic relationship consists of cult leaders' domination and members' submission. Cult leaders use their power to seduce, intimidate, and humiliate followers. Eventually, recruits learn that to live a spiritual life, they must follow the leader's ideology without question. If followers have doubts, some version of the devil is operating within them, and unless it is cast out through certain rituals, they will be subjected to dire consequences. The instilled belief that their leader's message is the Word of God allows leaders to gain control of the thinking of their followers. As a result of this, cult leaders are able to move the responsibility for doubt and even the pain inflicted away from themselves and onto parents or their children. Therefore, cult members learn to blame themselves for feeling differently than the cult leader, moving responsibility for trauma and injury away from each leader and onto themselves. This process has harmful implications for all family members. Ferenczi theorized that when we feel overwhelmed by an inescapable threat, we identify with the aggressor. Hoping to survive, we sense and become precisely what the attacker expects of us in our behavior, perceptions, emotions, and thoughts. Identification with the aggressor is closely aligned with other responses to trauma, including dissociation. Identifying with the aggressor is one way that the recruit defends himself. When a victim believes the same values as the aggressor is not perceived as a threat. In addition to incorporating the abuser's behavior, dress, and ideology, over time, cult members identify with the cult leader's contemptuous and punitive attitudes towards them. Another factor that destroys empathy between parents and children is life in the cult. And I'm going to first talk about life in the cult for parents. Family life from marriage to conception to childbirth to child rearing and schooling usually is dictated by the cult leader's evolving ideology. The need to meet and accept the requirements of the cult often induces parents to defend against their own natural parenting tendencies, to express loving feelings, or to protect or empathize with their children. Attempting to stifle these natural tendencies leaves many cult parents feeling depressed or anxious. In most cults, the needs of cult leaders supersedes the needs of the children. Cult leaders characteristically demand that children be sacrificed to the leader's control to prove the parents' commitment to the group. Parents often are separated both physically and emotionally from their own children. To prove their loyalty to the cult, parents are expected to spend long hours of time submitting to cult activities and rituals. Cult doctrine often emphasizes the benefits of communal care or care by alternative caretakers, and children might be placed in dormitories or sent away to cult-related boarding schools. Often the members in charge of the schools have little or no background in child development, education, and no understandings of the needs of a child. Even in those cults in which parents are allowed to raise their children in their own homes, there is cult interference. Often parents anxiously trying to remain free from trouble and meeting the demands of leadership have little emotional reserve to parent. Simultaneously, cult leaders undermine parental feelings of love. Parents are often made to feel selfish if they acknowledge special affection or protective feelings. Cult practices often are callous or harsh. In many cults, parents are taught that every adult has a right to discipline the children, and children are sometimes disciplined with belts or sticks. Cult ideology often teaches that children belong to the whole community rather than solely to their parents. In a large number of cults, children are instructed to address their parents by first names and address the cult leader as mother or father. Some second-generation members have reported that their cult attracted pedophiles that would capitalize on their access to children, and children were routinely sexually abused. When children or parents report this egregious behavior to the cult hierarchy, cults typically either whitewash these occurrences or blame the children for these events. Now I'll describe life in the cult for children. Therefore, cult ideology, driven by the predilections of the cult leader, incorporates various child-rearing practices that leave children more vulnerable to harmful treatment, including physical and sexual abuse, poor diet, impoverished living conditions, inadequate schooling, bizarre ideology, and inappropriate or harmful medical care. Cult ideology often results in leaving children to feel guilt-ridden and sometimes overly responsible for their poor circumstances and vulnerable to the acceptance of strange notions, as well as to feeling unprotected, overstimulated, or abandoned by their parents. Because of the reduction of the parental role to that of a sibling, children do not look up to or often respect their own parents. Children often cannot depend on their parents to protect them, and in some cases, children are sacrificed so that their parents could be seen in a positive light. Since anxious parents are preoccupied by the need to please the leadership, many children lack adequate comforting experiences at painful times, including times of trauma, neglect, or abuse. This lack of comforting interferes with their ability to learn how to comfort themselves, and therefore they have more difficulty in taking a soothing attitude towards themselves and developing a loving conscience. Cult children often come to believe that they have to manage situations on their own without support. Children are discouraged from expressing their own needs, particularly angry thoughts or wishes. As mentioned previously, they blame themselves for angry thoughts that are interpreted as expression of either the child's evilness or some outside force, such as the devil or evil spirits, that must be resisted. In cults, both children and adults who go against the wishes of the authority are shamed. If they take in the undermining message that they always must serve the needs of the leadership, to act in their own self-interest is seen as shameful. Therefore, this behavior must be hidden from others. Unfortunately, those with harsh consciences might feel flooded with shame rather than angry in circumstances in which they are being treated poorly. The feeling of shame keeps the blame on them rather than on the abuser. They are ready to accuse themselves of not living up to an impossible ideal. The feeling of shame might stem from a feeling of being exposed in their own attempt to respond to their own needs. For those who come to believe that their actions must serve the needs of others, shame is the price of individuation. After cult departure, first the parents. The unfreezing of their cult personalities might allow ex-member parents who are not narcissistic or antisocial to better empathize with and respond to their children. After they leave the cult, these parents typically are cognitively freer to become aware of the neglect and abuse of their children, as well as the fact that they did not protect them. Those cult member parents who had sought therapy with me have expressed tremendous guilt about the treatment that their children received while they were cult members. Along with this guilt, these cult parents often find themselves struggling with feelings of sadness about their missed opportunity to parent their children during their cult years. They often are dealing with second-generation children who are angry with them for abandoning them or failing to protect them from harm. With younger children, parents might have difficulty taking a parental role after they leave. This difficulty is related to the fact that they were induced into a regressed state by their cult leader, and therefore they acted as siblings to their children in the cult. Other parents might have trouble assuming authority as a result of the guilt about having neglected or abused their children while in the cult. This guilt can lead to a tendency to be too indulgent or to have difficulty setting needed limits with children. Some parents continue to hold on to the punitive or sexually stimulating practices of the cult, rationalizing their behavior as having been for their child's own good. Others, immersed in struggling with their own post-cult issues, continue to neglect their children. When working with parents, an assessment of child-rearing issues becomes an important aspect of therapy. The therapist not only explores all that occurred in the cult, but the client's experiences prior to the cult. The therapist can help former cult members begin to understand how cult dynamics interfered with their ability to respond to and protect their children, and to explore new ways of relating to their children now that they have left. Therefore, the therapist provides the context for the cult member's behavior. The parents probably parented their children in the way that they did because they were told this was the best way to care for their children. At times, the therapist will work with parents and children together to repair the distortions of the cult and increase empathy. For example, in working with a mother and her younger children after the cult, the children began to draw frightening pictures of hell and the end of the world. These were children who had been frightened by their cult leader into the need to display good soldier-like behavior. After leaving the cult, they continued to fear terrible consequences for what they perceived as bad behavior. I encouraged their mother to focus on telling her children about her sadness, that they had been frightened by the cult leader, and to explain that they no longer were part of a group that had beliefs of terrible or scary consequences for children who acted naughty ways. Instead, it was normal for children to act naughty sometimes. This was just the beginning of a mother's connection to her children through empathy, and the beginning of an ongoing discussion with her children about the harmfulness of the group. Now the children were able to view their mother as someone who could provide comfort and empathy, and they could share harmful experiences with her. The therapist can also point out the belief that parents have totally failed their children might be an extension of the black and white thinking of the cult. She can encourage parents to review times that they either contradicted or secretly went against the cult doctrine to respond to the needs of their children. In order to get in touch with their sense of empathy, parents are encouraged to review and reflect upon how separations from the children affected them when they were in the cult, how the cult rearing practices changed and usually worsened over time, occasions when they undermined or secretly went against the cult child rearing practices, how they felt when they saw or heard another child being abused. Looking at all this expands the parents' awareness of all the ways that their natural desires to protect their children were interfered with by the cult. This understanding is helpful in relieving some of the self-blame and shame. However, at the same time, it can increase a sense of sadness. In therapy, former cult member parents usually have the expectation that the therapist will blame them as their cult leader had blamed them, and as they are blaming themselves. In fact, they often expect that everyone in their current life will blame them. The therapist can help former cult members understand that therapy is a place for exploration rather than judgment. In keeping with this idea, the therapist can suggest that they place their cult behavior within the context of the mind control of a high-demand environment. It helps to see that with the information they had at the time, they probably did the best they could. Most of the cult parents with whom I have worked were recruited by their cults in their early 20s. They were idealistic and found a group that seemed to be comprised of like-minded individuals. If the group hadn't recruited them, they probably would have involved themselves in something less harmful and more worthy. Therefore, the therapist encourages the parents to move towards empathy for themselves and self-forgiveness, to see the life conditions that allow them to be receptive to the cult messages. Since the parents with whom I've worked were basically naive and honest, they imbued the cult leader with their own qualities of guilelessness. When they entered the cult, they never thought that their children would be prey to abuse or neglect. Instead, they believed they were entering into a better place, a utopian community for their children and themselves. Therefore, if they can, I encourage parents to listen to their children's feelings related to their cult experiences. This might increase their pain. However, listening to their children with as much empathy as they can muster is the best bridge to an improved relationship. It allows SGAs to feel that their parents, at least, are attempting to hear their story and attempting to understand their feelings about their childhood in the cult. Reconciliation. Well, you know what? Maybe what I'll do is...
You have plenty of time.
I have plenty of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're not stopping until 6:30.
Okay. I'll be well before that. Reconciliation. How do ex-member parents begin the process of reconciling with their second-generation children? I would recommend, as a first step, for former cult member parents to apologize to their children for their inability to better protect them from the harm they experienced in their childhood as a result of cult membership. At the time of the apology, it is important for parents not to launch into their own story about how they were controlled by the cult. Initially, their adult children can view a long explanation as an excuse, a rationalization for their lack of parenting. Therefore, a good beginning is a simple apology and to be receptive to hearing their child's experiences. Of course, this interaction will open the door to a great deal of pain, but I found that parents who have come for therapy already are experiencing tremendous pain and guilt. Listening to the truth of their children's experience also allows the parent to begin to show empathy and maybe even comfort, a role that was interfered with in the past. For adult children to thrive, it helps tremendously if they believe that their parents can handle the truth of their experience. Guilty feelings might underline a parent's desire to avoid listening to an SGA experience. However, avoidance of the truth because of guilt, or only focusing on the damage done to oneself in the cult, might keep SGAs in a parentified position, believing that they must be there to parent a parent who has been burdened by cult disillusionment or trauma. In response to their children's cult experience, the expression of authentic sadness and remorse for the suffering of their children can be a major step towards healing the rift between parents and children. I found that many children ultimately want to love and make a connection with their parents, even if they've needed to initially defend against these feelings with anger and withdrawal. Not to be able to make a connection with their parents takes its toll on SGAs. Although many whom I've come to know have created lives for themselves without this connection, it can be a source of continual pain. First-generation parents who can apologize for the harm done are providing their adult children with a gift of empathy and some degree of comfort, which all children ultimately desire, no matter how old. Later, perhaps at another time, cult parents can suggest to their children that if their children wish to know how they got involved in the cult and fell under the leader's spell, the parent will be ready to tell them. At some point, it will be healing for second-generation former cult members to hear their parents' stories and to learn about their parents' identity prior to the cult. There might be continued anger. It is important for former cult member parents to remember that children also were raised in the black and white thinking of the cult. Therefore, ambivalence is not something that comes easy to former cult members. SGAs wonder whether, if they let go of their anger and show love, it means that they condone their parents' abandonment of them. Parents can help if they are able to say that they understand that their children might be always angry with them. Also, it is crucial to understand that anger will protect their children against opening up and being hurt and abandoned by their parents once more. I'd like to now begin to talk about how I approach SGAs about this idea of empathy for their parents and forgiveness. Connected to empathy is the concept of forgiveness. Forgiveness for oneself as well as others. Definition of forgiveness: to stop feeling angry or resentful towards someone for an offense, flaw, or mistake. SGAs might not be able to completely stop feeling angry. However, it might be possible for some to begin to see parents in a richer, fuller way over time. Forgiving often coexists with periods of doubt, bitterness, and hurt. SGAs need not escape the painful feelings that the parent-child relationship has been altered by all that has happened in the past. We forgive as best we can, which is to say imperfectly. If we can move beyond tradition-sanctioned thinking in regard to forgiving, if we can adopt a more forgiving attitude towards what it may mean to forgive and also not to forgive, then we can free forgiveness from its moralistic moorings and claim its real healing potential in human relationships. Over 10 years ago, ICSA held its first SGA workshop in Connecticut. The minister who gave us seed money to begin our first workshop requested that we include the concept of forgiveness. Needless to say, this was a hot-button topic, particularly for those from Bible-based cults. However, I felt that this concept could be useful to SGAs. After several years, we renamed this presentation Moving On, a title that initially made the idea of forgiveness more acceptable. The central theme of this presentation is to forgive for your own benefit rather than for the benefit of those who've harmed you. To find a more palatable definition of forgiveness, I utilized Fred Luskin's definition from his book, Forgive for Good, to state that forgiveness is not for the offender. Forgiveness is the peace you feel when you let go of obsessional thoughts of hate. Forgiveness is taking back your power. taking responsibility for how you feel. Forgiveness is about your health and ability to have a meaningful life. It is not about the people who hurt you. Forgiveness helps you gain control over your feelings. What forgiveness is not. This is also from Luskin's book. Forgiveness is not condoning bad behavior. Forgiveness is not forgetting that something painful happened to you. Forgiveness is not denying or minimizing your hurt. Forgiveness is not reconciling with the offender. Forgiveness is not meaning that you have to give up your feelings. When this is discussed, I encourage SGAs to consider whether they are spending their time focused on anger from the past rather than moving ahead in their new life. If they are stuck in these feelings of anger for too long without some kind of resolution, this hating can be self-destructive. It can eat away at them and cause them both emotional and physical harm. I have them consider a resolution of anger within themselves for their own sake. I know that it is a major achievement to let go of obsessive rumination about the injurious behavior of the offending party, as well as letting go of the wish for some kind of retribution. However, I believe that hate should not be the central focus of their thoughts. I also have SGAs consider the concept of intention before judging the act. I contrast the possible intention of cult leaders and of cult member parents. I ask, what was the intention of the cult leader? Was the cult leader's intention to exploit and gain more power over the followers? Next, I ask, what was the intention of their parents in bringing them into a cultic environment? Did they enter the group as a way of escaping from the difficulties of their pre-cult lives? Did they enter the group with altruistic motives or a desire for a spiritual life? Did the cult leader exploit their parents' naivete? Did parents have difficulty dealing with the fact that you were being neglected or abused? Were they disassociated themselves? That is, were they under the spell of the cult leader and unable to assess the leader's behavior with a critical eye? Or instead, did they ignore their children's pain or sacrifice their children in order to gain favor with the cult leader? I believe that it is central to the well-being of each SGA to know the truth of his or her story. It also is important to attempt to understand the truth of their parents' story. I have SGAs consider that if we explore both intention and the limited abilities of all human beings, they might begin to change the unrealistic desire for perfection in human relationships and become more open to forgiving others and ourselves, including parents, when possible, for not fulfilling all they would have hoped for. In understanding intention, SGAs are gaining a fuller appreciation of reality. All of this implies a blow to the grandiose ideal that they can be perfect angels, or anyone can be perfect angels walking on earth. It also means giving up the notion that they can force perfection to occur no matter what the cost. Finally, it is giving up the idea of being defined by others to gain love. However, some of them will need to give up the belief that if they love with all their hearts and do all they can extract love from a person who is incapable of loving them. It can be difficult to forgive. It may mean giving up chronic resentment and harsh, irrational attacks against others or themselves. Of course, there are benefits to holding on to this anger. Many believe that holding on to anger will protect them from being controlled by others. After the cult, a former cult member's sense of identity in a new world can be very fragile. Anger and suspicion might serve to protect against becoming overly influenced. Anger might protect them from being disappointed, hurt, or feeling the pain of a lost relationship. However, an inability to forgive others after an appropriate apology is given might interfere with the development of trust and closeness in present relationships. It's important to move from cult absoluteness to a toleration for the ambiguities and limitations of life. If they are unable to let go of intense anger, they may be prevented from having a healthy and meaningful life. Self-forgiveness is difficult as long as one holds on to an impossible standard for oneself and holds on to the need for self-punishment. Intense self-punishing through obsessional thoughts or self-hatred, acts of contrition and shame is a way of keeping a connection with the cult leader's damaging attitudes. The emotion of shame tends to interfere with the possibility of self-forgiveness. Can SGAs forgive their own bystander status, their own moments of enthrallment, or their own dissociation? We cannot be heroes if we are so scared that we are frozen. How do we handle those who've hurt us? In cases where the suffering has been great, where there have been few, if any, positive experiences, where former cult members must avoid further contact with those from the past to avoid further harm. Perhaps the most they can achieve is giving up constant rage and resentment towards others for the SGA's own benefit. It concerns me that unrelenting rage can keep some former cult members in a state of bondage. Rage can hurt physical as well as emotional well-being. When is long enough, and when is the time to move away for the good of one's present life? I focus with SGAs on the fact that cult parents have failed children in their role of protectors. Some of them have become so debilitated by the cult experience that they continue to be childlike after they leave. These incapacitated individuals look to their children for care. A nurturing parent is the easiest parent to care for. However, when SGAs are dealing with parents who neglected them, the task of caring for debilitated parents can be quite challenging, particularly when adult children are attempting to keep themselves afloat. Sometimes the best SGAs can do is find a compromised position, finding a place that allows them to feel somewhat less guilty without sacrificing their life. Nevertheless, when exploitation and abuse has been great, sometimes the best possible position taken is complete avoidance. Let's return to the idea of intention. Let's consider what parents were conflicted when they submitted to the demands of the cult leader. Were they distraught about having to cause their children harm? Are they heartbroken about how their children were treated in the cult? Or are they either such true believers or so self-centered that they are unable or willing to see how they have harmed you? I suggest for some it might be less frightening to go against a parent than a powerful cult leader. Even after leaving the cult, many former members continued to believe that the cult leader has extraordinary powers, and they might fear that anger towards the cult leader will lead to punishment in the world of the next. Additionally, a failure to be angry with the cult leader might be an extension of the destructive dynamic of the cult. That is, always keeping anger and blame away from the cult leader and displacing it onto others. In those cases where there is no apology from parents, it might be difficult to understand and forgive. Consider that some parents might be so overwhelmed with guilt that it is too painful to acknowledge the harm of their actions. It is a sad truth that many parents cannot face the enormity of the harm they've inflicted on their children, and they do feel pain. Others continue to hold on to the belief that their children's treatment in the group was for their own good. It is difficult to accept that destructive attitude. As considered earlier, the question often becomes, how much time is enough? I have the SGAs consider that they are attending the workshop because they want to move ahead in their lives. I point out that they are courageous enough to examine that past, as painful as it was for them. They might feel angry because of the correct belief that they were cheated out of a childhood, that their parents failed them, but they can never change or recover their past or even change their parents in the present. They can only change themselves. I tell them that they have a right to continue to feel angry and sad about this. I point out that when the worst has happened, can they reflect upon what they can learn from the experience? How can they use those experiences to grow? I encourage them to consider small ways that they can flourish, even in difficult circumstances. Some have been determined to place their energy into a positive direction and therefore allow themselves to thrive. I ask SGAs to consider focusing upon enriching their lives through the arts, nature, physical activities, academics, or caring for pets. The important point here is to put energy to good use by thriving. Actions for good can make people feel less like passive victims of the past and more in control of the future. And it's a wonderful defiance against those who predicted failure. I think I'm going to stop here, but I just wanted you to have a sense of how, my thoughts are and how to help first-generation parents and second-generation children bridge the gap and maybe get a little closer to one another. Thank you.
Thank you.